The Century of Columbus by James Joseph Walsh. Preface. In a previous book, The 13th Greatest of Centuries, I described the period of human activity in which, as it appears to me, more was accomplished that is of significance in the expression of what is best in man and for the development of humanity than during any corresponding period of the world's history. To many people, it may now seem that I am setting up a rival to the 13th century in what is here called the Century of Columbus, the period from 1450 to 1550. I may as a foreword say, then, that there is no thought of that, and that I still feel quite sure that the 13th is the greatest of centuries, though it must be admitted that probably more supremely great men were at work in Columbus's century than in the preceding period. The 13th century is greatest, however, because its achievements were more widely diffused in their influence, and because more of mankind had the opportunity and the incentive to bring out the highest that was in them than at any other period in the world's history. As a consequence, a greater proportion of mankind was happy than ever before or since, for happiness comes only with the consciousness of good work done and the satisfaction of personal achievement. And that is the greatest period of human history, when man is the happiest. The Renaissance, however, for it is practically the period in history usually known by that name, which is here called the Century of Columbus, achieved results in every mode of human endeavor that have been inspiring models for all succeeding generations, most of all our own. Just why greatness in human achievement should thus occur in periods long separated from each other is hard to understand. I have sometimes suggested that there is probably a biological law in the matter, the factors of which are not well understood as yet. Every third or fourth year the farmer expects to have an apple or fruit year, as it is called, that is, to reap a fine fruit harvest, the fruit product of the intervening years having often been quite indifferent. Man is much more complex than the fruits, and so it takes a longer interval to prepare a great human harvest. Hence humanity has its supreme fruitage only every third or fourth century. Undoubtedly, Columbus's century is one of the finest fruit periods of human history. There was nothing that the men of the time did not do supremely well, and a great many of them did nearly everything that they took in hand better than any of their successors. As a curious contrast to our time, very few of them limited themselves to any one mode of expression. Because of its very contradiction of a great many of our prevalent impressions, as for instance the universal persuasion of constant human evolution and the supposed progress of mankind from year to year, but surely from century to century, and the thought so common that after all we must now be far ahead of the past, though there is abundant evidence of the vanity of this self-complacency. The story of Columbus's century should be interesting to our generation, since it furnishes the background of history on which alone the real significance of the discovery of our continent just after the end of the Middle Ages can be properly seen. It should have a special appeal to Americans. These are the reasons for writing the book. Owing to the large field that is covered, the author can scarcely hope to have escaped errors of detail. His only thought is that the broad view of the whole range of achievement may be sufficiently helpful to those interested in the history of human culture to compensate for faults that were almost inevitable. Its comprehensiveness may give the book a suggestive and retrospective value. It is addressed not to the special student, but to the general reader interested in all phases of human accomplishment, who wishes to fill in the outlines of political history with the story of the intellectual and ethical life of a great epoch. Thanks are due to Mr. Stephen Horgan for material aid in the selection of illustrations. No easy task because of the immense material to choose from. A definite effort has been made to avoid the well-known masterpieces and have the illustrations add to the knowledge of the time. Introduction. To many people, the date of the discovery of America must seem somewhat out of place. At least it must be hard for them to understand just how it came about that before the 15th century closed, so great a discovery as this of a new continent could be made. The Middle Ages are usually said to end with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, though a number of historians in recent years have begun to date the close of medieval history with the discovery of America itself. It scarcely seems consonant with the usually accepted ideas of widespread ignorance, lack of scientific curiosity, with the dearth of initiative and absence of great human interests during the Middle Ages, that so important an achievement as the discovery of America should have come at this time. In spite of the growing knowledge that has revealed the wonderful achievements of the medieval period, there are still a great many people who think themselves well informed, for whom the 1,000 years from about 500 to 1500 seem almost a series of blank pages, and it cannot but be very surprising to them that anyone should have been able to rise out of the slough of despond so far as regards human knowledge and enterprise, which these times are often declared to represent, to the climax of energy and daring and conscious successful purpose required for the discovery of the Western Hemisphere. Apparently, only a special dispensation of Providence preparing the modern time could possibly have brought this important discovery out of the Nazareth of the so-called Dark Ages. All sorts of explanations have been deemed necessary to account for Columbus's great discovery at this time. To some, it has seemed to be the result of a happy accident by which one of the deeply original spirits among mankind, with the wanderlust in his soul, succeeded finally in having someone provide him with the opportunity for a long, vague voyage on which, fortunately, the discovery of the Western Hemisphere was made. We hear much of happy accidents in scientific discoveries, and they are supposed to represent the fortunate chances of humanity. It must not be forgotten, however, that only to genius do these happy accidents occur. Newton discovered the laws of gravitation after having seen the apple fall, but many billions of men had seen apples fall before his time without being led to the faintest hint of gravitation. Galvani touched the legs of a frog by accident with his metal implements while making electrical experiments, and so became the frog's dancing master, in the contemptuous phrase of many of his scientific colleagues, and the father of biological electricity for us. But doubtless many others, lacking his scientific insight, had seen this phenomenon without having their attention particularly caught by it. It has been suggested that not a little of the good fortune that resulted in the discovery of the American continent was due to Columbus's obstinacy of character. He was a man who, having conceived an idea, was bound to carry it out, cost what it might. These are, of course, the men as a rule who make advances and discoveries and obtain privileges for us. They are not satisfied to be as others, and the world usually denominates them cranks. They insist on doing things differently, and their vision of great achievement does not fade or become dim even under the clouds of objections that men are prone to rouse against anything, and above all, any purpose that they themselves cannot understand. Columbus is said to have been one of these mortals who are actually urged on by obstacles, and who cannot be made to back down from their purpose by rebuffs and refusals, or even by the disappointments after preliminary encouragement, which are so much harder to bear. Columbus's steadfastness of character during the voyage, which enabled him to overcome the murmurings of his men and keep his ships to their course in spite of almost mutiny, is a reflex of this trait of his character, and yet there have been no end of obstinate men who have never succeeded in accomplishing anything worthwhile. Once engaged on the expedition, or in the preliminaries for it, Columbus's obstinacy of character, in the better sense of that expression, was simply invaluable. But the question is, how did he become engaged on the expedition at this time? It takes only a little consideration of the history of the time in which Columbus was educated, and the story of the accomplishment of the men who lived around him during the half-century that preceded the discovery of America to realize exactly why the discovery was made at this particular time. There has probably never been a period when so many supremely great things were done, or when so many men whose enduring accomplishment has influenced all the after generations were alive, as during the nearly 70 years of Columbus's lifetime. In order to illustrate, then, the background of the history of the discovery of America, it has seemed worthwhile to take what may be called Columbus's century, from 1450 to 1550, and show what was accomplished during it. The discovery of America came just about the middle of it, and represents one of a series of great achievements made by the men of the time, which are destined never to lose in interest for mankind. To know the other great events and great men of the period is to appreciate better just what the discovery of America meant, and the place that Columbus's work in this regard should have in the history of human accomplishment. The present volume can be at best only a very brief review of the great achievements and the story of the lives of the men of this time. John Ruskin once said that the only proper way to know the true significance of a period of human history was to study the book of its arts, the book of its deeds, and the book of its words, that is, to weigh the significance of its artistic accomplishment, the meaning of what its men did for their fellow men, and the worth of its literature in terms of world achievement. Judged by this standard, Columbus's century must be placed among the greatest periods of human accomplishment in the world's history. It is the Renaissance period, and as everyone knows, this is a famous epoch in modern times. It has been a favorite study of a great many scholars in a great many generations since. It introduced many of the ideas, indeed most of the important thoughts and inventions on which our modern progress is founded. It is true that its great impetus came from the impulse given by the reintroduction of Greek ideas and Greek ideals into the modern world, but only that there were men of talent and genius capable of being stirred to achievement by Greek incentive, nothing great would have been accomplished. Besides, while it owes much to Greece, it is great in its own right, and its men added much to what came to them out of Greece and adopted and adapted classic ideas and ideals so as to make them of great significance in the modern world. As regards the book of the arts of Columbus's century, scarcely more need be said in this introductory chapter than what has already been suggested, that this is the Renaissance period. All the world now knows of the art of the Renaissance, and of all that was accomplished by men who lived during the century after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Every form of art, painting, sculpture, architecture, music, as well as the arts and crafts, achieved a supreme expression at this time. Everywhere, particularly in Italy, men started up as if a new life had come into the world, and proceeded to the accomplishment of artistic results which had apparently been impossible to preceding generations, and, alas, for the notion of human progress, have often been the despair of succeeding generations. If imitation is the sincerest flattery, then these artists of the Renaissance period have indeed been flattered, for it has almost been the rule in the aftertime to imitate them, and even the greatest of the artists of succeeding generations have been deeply influenced by the work of these men, and usually have been quite willing to confess how much they owe to them. In Italy, the list of names of painters who are at this time doing work which the world will never willingly let die is long and glorious. There has never been a period of equal influence and achievement in this mode of art in the history of the race. Almost every city in Italy produced a group of painters during this century who would make a whole nation famous in any other period. The Florentine school surpasses all the others in importance, and such names as Fra Angelico, Benozzo Gozzoli, Fra Bartolomeo, Lippo Lippi, and Filippino Lippi, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Leonardo da Vinci, Andrea del Sarto, Masaccio, and Michelangelo occur in its history. Venice produced in the first half of our period such men as the Vivarini, the Bellini, Titian, Carpaccio, Palmavecchio, Giorgione, and Lorenzo Latti, worthy predecessors of the great names that were to come in the second half, Tintoretto and Paolo Veronese. The Umbrian school of painters includes a group of men born in the hill towns of Umbria, to be credited, therefore, to more than a single city, but their greatness is sufficient for the glory of any number of cities. Gentile da Fabriano, Bonfigli, Perugino and his pupils, Pinturicchio, Lo Spagna, and many others, above all, Raphael. Bologna possessed the three Carracci, Guido, Domenicino, and Grecino. Parma had Correggio, Ferrara, Dosso Dossi, and Garofalo. Padua, Andrea Mantegna and his master, Squarcione, and Rome, the pupils of Raphael, Giulio Romano, Sassoferrato, and Carlo Maratta and da Imola. These schools of Italian painting embrace all the modes of expression with the brush in their scope. The other countries of Europe, however, were not without distinguished representatives of the wondrous art spirit of the time. In Germany, there were Albrecht Dürer and the Holbeins. In the lowlands, the Van Eyck's greatest work came just before the opening of the century and inspired Memling, van der Weyden, Quentin Matsys, and others. In Spain, such men as Zurbarán and Ribalta were worthy forerunners of the great geniuses Velázquez and Murillo, who represent the aftermath of the glorious harvest of the workers in the field of art during this Renaissance period. They were all willing to confess their obligations to the great painters of the preceding age, and their work is really a continuation of that Renaissance spirit. The accomplishment of the painters of Columbus's period proved as copious in stimulus for subsequent painters as the great navigators' discovery of America proved the stimulus to explorers, discoverers, and empire makers during the subsequent century. A great wind of the spirit was blowing abroad, and men were deeply affected by it, and accomplished results almost undreamt of before, and even when the wind of the spirit was dying down, it still moved men to achievements that had only been surpassed during the immediately preceding period, and that were to be looked up to with admiration and envy, and given that sincerest of praise, imitation, during all the succeeding centuries. The artists of Columbus's century, this great Renaissance period, were never merely artists. Some of them, like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, though among the greatest painters in the world, preferred to think of themselves as something else than painters. Leonardo has painted the greatest of portraits, but was a great engineer, an architect, an inventor, a scientist, and anything else that he cared to turn his hand to. Michelangelo was undoubtedly a great painter, yet this was the least of his accomplishments, for he was greater as an architect, a sculptor, and perhaps even as a poet than he was as a painter. Raphael, besides being a painter, was an architect and above all an archaeologist. It was a sad loss to classic archaeology that he did not live to accomplish his plan of making a model of old Rome. He was a great student of the techniques of his art, and if he had not died at the early age of 37, would surely have accomplished much besides painting. Many of the painters and sculptors of the time had been goldsmiths or workers in metal, and nearly all of them were handicraftsmen, handy with their hands and capable of doing things. Practically all of them were architects, and many of them proved their powers in this regard. A man of the Renaissance always thought he could do anything well, and specialism was the last thing in the world thought of. Their confidence in their own powers gave them a wonderful breadth of ability to accomplish. In sculpture, the role of great names is scarcely less wonderful than that of the great painters. It includes such men as Verrocchio and Leopardi, Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Della Robbias, Benvenuto Cellini, and many others of less fame in this great period, but who would have been looked up to as wonder workers in the art at any other time. The sculpture work, for instance, that was accomplished in connection with Certosa at Pavia, though out of harmony with some of the true aims of sculpture, shows how beautifully Renaissance men worked out artistic ideas of any kind. Glorious as is the list of sculptors in Italy, other countries are by no means eclipsed by Italian preeminence. The work of the great sculptors of Nuremberg, Adam Kraft and Peter Vischer, as well as of the coterie of sculptors who did the wonderful group of heroes at Innsbruck, show how the wind of the spirit of genius in art was blowing abroad everywhere. In the Low Countries, while we do not always know the names of the sculptors, their beautiful monuments are with us. Such beautiful work as the Tomb of Mary of Burgundy, made by Peter Becker of Brussels, is an enduring memorial of artistic excellence. There are wood carvings everywhere through the Low Countries that display the artistic genius of the time. In France, Colomb, trained in Flanders, did beautiful work, and Jean Just and his son have left a monument of their sculptural genius in the cathedral at Tours. Jean Fouché made the lovely tomb of Agnes Sorel at Loches, and after the spirit of the Renaissance had come to France, Jean Goujon and Germain Pilon achieved their masterpieces. The reliefs of Jean Goujon for the Fountain of the Innocents are very well known and often to be seen in copies. The Three Graces of Germain Pilon, though already there is perhaps some sign of decadence, is a charming work of art that has never been excelled in the modern time. In architecture, Columbus' century is, if anything, more famous than for its accomplishment in the other arts. Almost every city in Italy has a distinguished architect who has left behind him a monument of genius. Brunelleschi died just before the century. Bramante, Alberti, Leonardo da Vinci, and above all Michelangelo are the great names of the time. Such other names as Palladio, San Gallo, Della Porta, Sansovino, and San Michele come after these, and the work of this group of men has more influenced succeeding generations than any other. The monuments of this time include the Cathedral of Santa Croce at Florence, St. Peter's at Rome, and many of the great palaces and hospitals that now are the subject of so much admiration and attention from scholarly visitors to Italy. In our own time, the reproduction of Renaissance architectural types and the careful study of what the Italian Renaissance did in modifying for modern use classic types of architecture has done more to give us handsome monumental buildings than any other inspiration that men have had. Unfortunately, the Renaissance, in its adoration of classic types and ideals, developed a contempt for the older Gothic architecture that had many sad effects on taste in art. But the people of the period succeeded in building a glorious monument to themselves for all time. This same century saw the rise and marvelous development of music in nearly every department of that art, and in a way that strikingly illustrates how the genius of this time gave to men a power of lofty expression in every aesthetic mode. In this form of art, Italy was not, as in other departments of aesthetics, the leader, though she proved the apt pupil, excelling before the close of the period even her masters. It is to the Flemings that we owe the great beginnings of music at this time, as we also owe to them and to their brethren of Holland so much in all the arts. Ockenheim of Hainault, and his pupils, above all Josquin, developed the technique of polyphonic music, and Flanders furnished music masters for every important capital of Europe. Claude Goudimel, born in Avignon, but educated in Flanders, opened his famous school of music in Rome in the first half of the 16th century, and while not perhaps, as has often been said, the teacher of Palestrina, he helped to create the Roman school in which developed the brothers Animuccia and the brothers Nannini. Orlando de Lasso did his work at this time, and Stefano Vaneo of Recanati published his treatise on counterpoint in 1531. The use of the chord of the dominant seventh was invented, and St. Philip Neri encouraged those religious musical exercises which culminated first in the oratorio and subsequently in what we know as opera. As always happens in a really great artistic period, there was a magnificent development of the crafts as well as of the arts, when such men as Verrocchio, probably even Leonardo da Vinci himself, Pollaiuolo and Benvenuto Cellini were looked upon as goldsmiths as well as sculptors. It is easy to understand how thoroughly artistic was the goldsmithery of the time. As a matter of fact, most of the artists of the Renaissance were trained in workshops. These were not only technical schools, but art schools of the finest kind. As a consequence, not only in gold and metalwork, but in every other craft, art impulses of lofty achievement are noted. The stained glass of the time is among the most beautiful ever made. All glass-making and porcelain reached a high plane of perfection. It is interesting to note the decadence of fine glass-making that begins toward the end of our period. Gem-cutting reached a climax of perfection at this time that has ranked Renaissance gems among the most precious in the world. The art of the medal and the medallion was another artistic specialty of this time in which it has probably never been excelled and very seldom equaled. In bookmaking, artistic craftsmanship surpassed itself. Before the development of printing as the exclusive mode of making books, there was a marvelous evolution of illuminated handmade books. Many specimens still extant are among the most beautiful in the world. With these as models, the printed books came to be just as wonderful artistic products, and so we have during Columbus's period the finest bookmaking that the world has ever known. Every portion of the book, the print, the spacing, the paper, the binding was artistically done. What seemed a mere handicraft was lifted to the plane of art, and whenever in the aftertime, and never more so than in our own period, men have wanted models for beautiful bookmaking, they have gone back to those produced during this period. The book of the deeds of the century will be best appreciated from the names of the doers, the men of action of this wonderful time. History was indeed making. What came with the rise of the Portuguese Empire, mainly through the influence of Prince Henry and of the Spanish Empire in America under Ferdinand and Isabella, were only the great beginnings of the wealth and power Europe was to draw from overseas colonies. Unfortunately, the century was a period of political unrest. The seething spirit that led to great achievement in every department gave rise to many wars and disturbances. The Wars of the Roses in England, and the many wars in Italy, with the political disaffection in Germany and the disturbed state of France, made human life very cheap, just when it was capable of most enduring accomplishment. Great monarchs like the Emperor Charles V, Francis I, King of France, and Henry VIII of England worked good and harm in proportions very hard to estimate properly. There was never a more tyrannical king than Henry VIII, and probably never a less just one than Francis I. Bishop Stubbs, the English constitutional historian, has claimed for Charles V the right to the title Great, yet there is so much that is at least questionable about his career as a ruler that history will probably never willingly accord it. The military exploits, the courtly intrigues, the corrupt diplomacy, the exhibition of the ugliest traits of mankind were all emphasized in this period, because great men are great also in the ill they do. But fortunately there is another side to the book of the deeds of the century worth while reading. Among the events of the century are the great Battle of Pavia at which Francis I of France was defeated so thoroughly that afterwards, while confined in the Certosa, he sent the famous dispatch to his mother, "All is lost, save honor." This century saw also the famous meeting of the Field of the Cloth of Gold, at which both English and French nobles went so gaily attired, and with so many handsome changes of raiment, that literally not a few of them carried their castles on their backs, quote unquote. Their subsequent bankruptcy strengthened the hands of the crown in both countries. This, unfortunately, did more than anything else to lay the foundations of that absolutism which needed the French Revolution and its successors in other countries of the past century to break up. It was the time of the famous Diet of Worms and of the political and religious disturbances which have been called the Reformation. Though in recent years historians have come to recognize the movement not as a great epoch-making reform in religion, of which it brought about the disintegration by its doctrine of individual judgment, but as a religious revolt affecting the northern nations of Europe, disturbing the continuity of the traditions of culture and education and art, which had been so completely under the influence of the old church, and which among these northern nations were not caught up again for several centuries after this unfortunate division in Christianity. The greatest accomplishment of this period, however, was its scholarship. In every country in Europe, men devoted themselves to the study of the Latin and Greek classics, and opportunities for education of the highest import were recorded everywhere. They were no merely dry-as-dust scholars, and the names of such men as Aeneas Sylvius Piccolomini, who was afterwards Pope Pius II, of Aldus Manutius, and the great Venetian printer, of Leon Battista Alberti, famous not only as a scholar, but as an architect and an artist in every mode, and Lorenzo de Medici himself, are only brilliant examples in a single country of a scholarship that was eminently productive and influential. In every country in Europe, the story is the same. At the beginning of this book, it seemed that the scholarship of the century might be summed up in a single chapter. I found that even a single chapter for Italy was quite inadequate, and that the Teutonic countries of themselves required another chapter, even for quite incomplete record of their scholarly achievements. Rudolf Agricola, Reuchlin, who was known as the three-tongued wonder of Germany, Desiderius Erasmus, the most influential scholar of Europe in this intellectual period, Jakob Wimpfeling, the schoolmaster of Germany, Melanchthon, the gentle Praeceptor Germanicae, or German teacher, and all the products of the schools of the brethren of the common life serve to demonstrate the greatness of the German scholarship of this period. In England, there are such men as Bishop Selling, Cardinal Morton, Archbishop Warham, Dean Colet, Thomas Linacre, Dr. John Caius, Roger Ascham, Thomas More, and many others who in any other period would be reckoned among the distinguished scholars. And yet the other Latin countries did not lag much behind Italy, and were fair rivals of the Teutonic countries in scholarship at this time. Queen Isabella herself learned Latin when she was already a queen on the throne. Court fashions are sure to spread, and this did. Besides, the queen encouraged Cardinal Ximenes in the production of that magnificent monument of scholarship, the Complutensian Polyglot Bible. The development of the universities in Spain only parallels the corresponding movement in the rest of Europe, but there were probably more higher institutions of learning founded, and above all, more refounded and reestablished on a broader basis at this time than at any other corresponding period of history. In France, the index of scholarly accomplishment is the foundation of the Collège de France, which was to mean so much for French intellectual life. It made it possible for scholars to pursue their work unhampered by the fossilized University of Paris, which had become cramped in old-fashioned ways, and for the time being was incapable of doing great intellectual work itself, and yet, owing to the charters and privileges granted it in its flourishing period, was still capable of crushing out the true spirit of knowledge and preventing real development. There has never been a time in the world's history when scholarship, insofar as that term means knowledge of the great books of the past, occupied so prominent a place in men's minds or had so much influence. Nor has there ever been a time when so many of those in power felt that the very best thing that they could do for their people, as well as for their own fame, was the encouragement of learning. Scholars were more highly honored than at any period in the world's history. Even ruling princes and the higher nobility felt that they owed it to themselves to be acquainted with the great works of literature, or pretend at least to a knowledge of them, and that a portion of their policy must be to patronize teachers and scholars of the new learning. To be a patron of scholars was considered quite as important as to act in a similar capacity for painters, sculptors, and architects, though there might be more personal fame attached to securing the works of the great masters in art. Fortunately, these scholars were encouraged in their labors, and we have a whole series of wonderful editions of the old classics accomplished at a cost of time and labor and patience that only a few of those who have labored at such work under ever so much more favorable circumstances can properly appreciate. Their editions were issued as beautiful books in this wonderful time, and so they have remained as precious treasures for us down to our own day. The achievements in art and scholarship in this century are well known and universally recognized. It is seldom appreciated, however, that the century is almost as great in its wonderful progress in science as it is in any other intellectual department. The foundations of our modern sciences were laid broad and deep at this time, and achievements of scientific generalization, as well as accurate and detailed observation, were made, that may be placed with confidence in comparison with those of any other time in the world's history, even our own. Copernicus's theory probably revolutionized men's thinking more with regard to the earth and the universe of which it forms a part than the thought of any man has ever done during the whole history of mankind. The great medical scientists of this period almost as effectually revolutionized men's thinking with regard to the constitution of men and animals as Copernicus had done with regard to the universe. Vesalius, called the father of modern anatomy, has left us a monument of genius in his work on the structure of the human body, and his famous contemporaries, Eustachius, another Columbus, the anatomist, and Cesalpino, as well as Servetus, added to the knowledge of anatomy and physiology which Vesalius had so well begun. Servetus and Columbus described the circulation of the blood in the lungs about the same time, and shortly after the close of our period, Cesalpino, trained in the schools of this time, described the circulation of the blood in the body. In every department of biological science, in anatomy and physiology, in pathology, in botany, in zoology, in paleontology, in ethnology, and linguistics, in anthropology, noteworthy advances were made. Magnificent applications of the knowledge acquired were made for the benefit of man and animals. New plants for medicine were sought in distant countries, and a great new development of medicine took place. None of the anatomists and physiologists of the time failed to use their knowledge for the increase of information with regard to disease and its treatment. Vesalius, besides being a great anatomist, was almost as great a pathologist and one of the epoch-making diagnosticians of medical history. He was the first since the Greeks to describe an aneurysm, that is, the pathological dilatation of an artery through disease or accident, and the first in the history of medicine to demonstrate the presence of such a condition on the living subject. Paracelsus, Ambroise Paré, Linacre, John Caius, and a whole host of great teachers in Italy are names to conjure with in the history of medicine and of surgery. There is probably no period in the world's history that has so many names famous in medicine that the world will never willingly let die. The supremely great accomplishments of this time, however, the true good and great deeds of the century, were what it did for men. This is the period when there was more organization for social help and uplift than at any other period that we know. Every social need was responded to by the guilds. There were old age pensions, disability wages, insurance against fire, accident at sea, burglary, highway robbery, the destruction of crops, the death of animals, and all the other developments of mutual protection against the unexpected, which we have been inclined to think were developments of our time. There were 30,000 guilds in England, it is said, when they were suppressed by Henry VIII, and the money in the treasuries, many millions of pounds, confiscated on the plea that they were religious organizations. They maintained grammar schools, had burses at the universities, arranged for technical training and apprenticeships, cared for orphans, provided entertainments for the people of the town, brought the membership together in friendly meetings and banquets several times each year, held athletic contests, encouraged social life and innocent amusements in every way, and represented an ever-vital nucleus of fraternal interest among men. Our chapter on this shows, too, how seriously the moneyed men of the time took their duty of philanthropic care for their townsmen by various institutions. A period that did so much for social needs could scarcely be expected to have neglected its hospitals, and as a matter of fact, some of the most beautiful hospitals in the world were built in this period, and everywhere that a hospital was built, it was worthy of its purpose. The hospitals of a later time, especially the 18th and 19th centuries, were little better than jails and were eminently unsuitable. At this time, citizens, instead of thinking that anything was good enough for the ailing poor, felt that the honor of the city was concerned, and the hospital, being a municipal building, was constructed with as much care for its beauty externally and its utility internally as the famous town halls or churches of the time. We know how well patients were cared for, since we have abundant evidence of the clinical teaching of medicine at the bedside. Whenever hospitals are well built and the attendant physician takes students with him on his rounds, the best possible treatment of patients is assured. They cared finely for the insane also, and for the weak-minded. The awful abuses in this regard that came in the 18th century, and from which our own happier, though far from satisfactory conditions represent a reaction, were a lamentable, almost incomprehensible degeneration from the magnificent work of the earlier time. The women of Columbus's century are worthy in every way of a place beside the men of their time. Those who in recent years have talked of the 19th century as the first period in the world's history when women secured an opportunity for the higher education forget amazingly many phases of feminine education of the long ago. The University of Salerno had its Department of Women's Diseases in the charge of women professors in the 12th century. There were feminine professors at the University of Bologna in the 13th century, and as a matter of fact, in no century since the 12th has Italy been without distinguished women professors at one or more of the Italian universities. Above all, those who talk of feminine education as a recent evolution must be strangely forgetful of the women of the Renaissance. In Italy, in France, in Spain, in Germany, in England, there were long series of distinguished women, some noted for their scholarship, some for their artistic taste, some for their literary power, all of them for a fine influence on the men of the time and an inspiration to what was best. Much of the wonderful social history of the time is due to them. But there is no department of intellectual or moral uplift in which their names are not prominent. Vittoria Colonna, the d'Estes, the women of the House of Medici, the Gonzagas in Italy, Queen Anne of Bretagne, and Margaret of Navarre in France, Queen Isabella of Castile, Queen Catherine of England, Margaret More, Mary, Queen of Scots, Margaret of Bourgogne, Lady Jane Grey, Queen Elizabeth. When was there ever such a galaxy of learned women alive during the same 100 years? Besides these known in secular literature, there was St. Angela of Merici, the great founder of the Ursulines, St. Catherine of Genoa, the wonderful organizer of charity, St. Teresa, probably the greatest intellectual woman who ever lived, and other women distinguished for supreme qualities of mind and heart almost too numerous to mention. The hardest chapters of the book to compress have been those on feminine education and the women of the century. What they did to make their homes beautiful and their home surroundings charming, how they inspired the artists of the time, what they did to bring out the best that was in them, this indeed makes a difficult story to tell in a few pages. Their contributions to the intellectual treasure of mankind were not very large, and only 2 or 3 of them have a name that will endure in literature and none of them in art. But what they accomplished for the ethical progress of the race at a particularly dangerous time, when the study of pagan authors and of Grecian art had relaxed the fiber of Christian morality, represents a triumph of feminine accomplishment of which too much cannot be said in praise. The Book of the Words of the century forms the least important chapter of the accomplishment of the time, and as compared with the arts and the deeds, its literature seems almost disappointing. Yet it must not be forgotten that this was the age of Leo X, of which Saintsbury, in the earlier Renaissance, in his series of periods of European literature, says, "Of few epochs is it more difficult to speak in brief space than of this century." He adds that the age of Leo X was for no small length of time, and under many changes of prevailing literary taste, extolled as one of the greatest ages of literature, as perhaps the greatest age of modern literature. It fell from this high estate about a century ago, but the reaction against it was, as always is the case with reactions, exaggerated, and we are gradually growing in the appreciation of the greatness of the literature of the time again. We now know that there are very few periods that have contributed so much that is really of enduring value to world literature as this age of Leo X. The Latin literature alone of this century would be enough to assure it a place as one of the wonderful productive periods in world letters. The Imitation of Christ was not written during the century, though its author seems to have put it into the ultimate form in which we now know it, about the beginning of our period. It was during this time that it came to be recognized as a great source of consolation, a marvelous study of the human heart in time of trial and of triumph, and the most influential book that had ever come from the hand of man. We have gathered together a small sheaf of the tributes that have been paid to it by some of the serious thinkers in all generations since. But it would be easy to fill a volume with words of highest commendation. In the Latin literature of this period also must be counted Sir Thomas More's Utopia, which has been read in every generation that has taken its social problems seriously ever since, and never more so than in our own time. It deserves a place in world literature beside Plato's Republic, and it is far ahead of any of the attempts at the description of a socialized state made in our time. For scholars, at least Erasmus's writings represent an enduring contribution to Latin literature of the classic type, a storehouse of information with regard to the scholarship and also lack of scholarship of the time. For those interested in mystical subjects, St. Ignatius's Spiritual Exercises is another of the Latin works of the period which, though it can scarcely be classed as literature, for, as we have said, Ignatius, like Michelangelo, wrote things rather than words, must take its place amid Columbian letters of lasting value, since it is more used now than ever before. There are not many surpassing works of vernacular literature from this time, and yet Machiavelli's history represents the only contribution to historical literature that takes a place in human interests beside the immortal trio of classical historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, and Tacitus. Ariosto represents one of the favorite works of Italian scholars, and as the Italians have been the most cultured people in the world ever since, their critical judgment must be accepted as of great value. In popular literature, the tales of chivalry, the picaresque romances or tales of roguery, and the almost endless number of Italian novels show how wide must have been the popular reading of the time. In France, Villon has always been a favorite for all classes, and with Charles of Orleans, he has been known by scholars, at least outside of France, and thoroughly appreciated. French modes of verse following the Italian came to influence the other countries of Europe at this time, and have never ceased to supply ideas for the form of the less serious modes of poetry, at least for all the generations down to our own. The influence of Clement Marot, of Brantôme, and the Pleiades was felt in every literature of Europe, and has not completely disappeared even after nearly 4 centuries that have elapsed since their time. The literature of the century contains, besides the names of Rabelais, as well as Calvin in France, Baldassare, Castiglione, Michelangelo, Vasari, Politian, Bembo, Lorenzo de' Medici, Pico della Mirandola, and the learned ladies Vittoria Colonna, Margaret of Navarre, Lucretia Tornabuoni, the mother of Lorenzo de' Medici, as well as the great scholars of the period in Italy. In Spain, St. Teresa and the great mystical writers were compensating for the triviality and worse of the picaresque romances and the tales of chivalry. In Portugal, the young genius of Camões was nurtured, while in England Sir Thomas More was laying the foundations of modern English prose, the great morality plays. Everyman and The Castle of Perseverance were written, and the first fruits of English dramatic literature in its more modern form came in Ralph Royster Doyster and Gammer Gurton's Needle. In Germany, the literary product of the vernacular was less significant, but Luther's great popular hymns and his vernacular translation of the Scriptures gave a vigorous birth to modern German verse and prose, while Hans Sachs and the Minnesingers did as much for popular poetry. Few periods can present a literature so rich in every country, so varied, with so many enduring elements, and with so much that remains as the constant possession of scholars ever since. The literature of the time may not equal its art or even its science, but no apologies are needed for it. In a word, then, the books of the arts, the deeds of the words of Columbus's century, when read even a little carefully, show us a marvelous period in which man's power of achievement was at its very highest. Its art in every department has never been excelled, and has only been equaled by that of the Greeks, from whom, however, we possess no painting worthy of the name. Its intellectual achievements in scholarship and in science give it the leadership in education in the modern world at least. What it accomplished for men in great works of humanity represent a triumph of humanitarianism in the best sense of the word, and present achievements worthy to be emulated by the modern time. The book of its words is of less import, and yet there are not more than 2 or 3 periods in the world's history that have surpassed it, and there are some modes of literature in which it is unexcelled. In the midst of this century, the discovery of America, instead of being a surprise, cannot but seem the most natural thing in the world. Everywhere men were doing things that for many centuries men had been unable to do, and they were achieving triumphs in every form of human effort. Given the fact that there was a large undiscovered portion of the world, it was more likely to be discovered at this time than at any other time in the world's history. That is the background of Columbus's discovery of America, which anyone who wants to understand its place must know. End of Introduction to the Century of Columbus by James Joseph Walsh.